President Proctor, go ahead.
Today is May 5th, 2022, and this is the board study session for the San Mateo-Foster City School District, and I'm calling the meeting to order at 1:04. Let's stand and do a flag salute, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we'll start with roll call. Trustee Warren. Yeah. Trustee Chin.
Here.
Trustee Corzo. Present. Trustee Watson. Here. And I'm also here. Item number 4 is approval of the agenda for today's meeting.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Thank you, Trustee Chin for the motion and Trustee Watkins for the second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Okay. We will move on to item 5.1, public statements related to agenda items. Please limit your statements to 3 minutes. And because this is a special meeting, we just have one item on the agenda. So that's the only topic to speak on. Peter, we don't have anyone here. Would you mind checking?
Absolutely. For those that are attending, if you would like to make public comment on today's agenda, please use the raise your hand functionality within Zoom now. Okay, Randy, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. I was really looking forward to this study session. Although I won't be able to attend the whole thing, I wanted to avail myself of the opportunity to make this statement. I've read the available policies that are on the agenda and the changes, and I really appreciate the thoughtful modifications that have been made to the ones that are available. I originally brought the concerning policy for questioning and apprehension by law enforcement to the board back in, I want to say it was 2018. It was back under a previous superintendent. And I want to kind of bring up how that was met when I even wanted to bring that to the board. Before I brought that to the board, the previous superintendent made a statement anticipating what the concern was going to be to dismiss what that person anticipated was going to be my concern about this policy, trying to undermine whatever it was that I was going to say. That is not inconsistent with other behavior that I've actually seen from board members and that I have experienced myself and that I've seen dealt out by specific board members, and really that I consider to be bullying by adults toward other adults. And it's really interesting because bullying is one of the other policies that you mentioned here. And it's really hard to, make decisions about bullying and to make decisions about things that are this important when that behavior isn't really modeled by all of the people that have been selected to represent us. And it's just really sad. Some of the ways that I've experienced this, just in the last couple of meetings, bringing up that the annex is a cash positive program. And immediately one of the trustees said, I take great offense, except that it is. There have been other times as I've spoken that other trustees have rolled their eyes or shake their heads. And it's not just me, but I'm speaking on my behalf. And I think, I suggest that as you examine these policies, that you recommit yourselves to. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Okay, President Proctor, we have no other hands for public comment.
Okay, then we will move on to item 6.1, equity school district policies aimed at dismantling the school to prison pipeline.
Great, thank you, President Proctor, members of the board. Really excited to have this study session devoted to the topic that we're discussing today. In the description available online regarding this agenda item, part of what it does is it really highlights how today's meeting is a step in a part of a process that began several years ago. So I want to acknowledge that because I think it's important that the public look at what changes, what it takes to implement change over time. The way that it can be frustrating sometimes on a school board. It can be frustrating to be a parent and say, I can see the problem. Like, let's address the problem right now. And also the process that you put in place to be able to arrive at the solutions that you really want for your school district. I think that what you have in front of you is very innovative. I want to double down on the idea that it is very thoughtful work. You have a team of people that work here at the district office, and that is Dr. Margarita Heredia. She's our Director of Student Services. Your your Assistant Superintendent of Student Services, Dennis Hills, and your Assistant Superintendent of Educational Services, David Chambliss. The three of them have been working for 6 months with Moira Denine, who is a consultant that works with our school district, to develop what you see in front of you today. These individuals meet together on a weekly basis to devote the time necessary to conduct the work that you see here in front of you, which is the very beginning of this process was to actually look through all of our board policies to identify priority board policies. And those are the policies you see in front of you today. I'll read them for you and for members of the public. Discipline, bullying, weapons and dangerous instruments, suspension and expulsion due process, conduct, questioning and apprehension by law enforcement, chronic absence and truancy, student disturbances, use of seclusion and restraint, conflict resolution and peer mediation, sexual harassment, multi-tiered systems of support, parent rights and responsibilities, alcohol and other drugs, safety, absences and excuses, district school attendance review board, intra-district enrollment, involuntary student transfers, search and seizure, bus conduct, test integrity and test preparation, academic honesty and wellness, and dress and grooming. So the team, after a series of meetings debating the many, many policies we have, felt that the ones I just listed, which are on this revision table chart, they really encapsulated the board policies that we felt were the biggest priority to continue this work. From there, the team set off in identifying of those policies which would reach this place first. And those are actually printed for you today. They're attached to the board agenda. Those are conduct and discipline, questioning and apprehension, and bullying. And the idea is to work our way through this list, this chart. We expect it to take no less than a year to make it through this chart. And I want to have a conversation with the board about why making these kind of changes is something that tends to be unusual for school districts. As you all know, we participate in a consortium of school districts in San Mateo County and throughout the state of California. Every school board has its own authority, but you all impact each other. When one school board takes action on something, it often has a trickle effect on other school boards. And so with school board policies, especially those that deal with issues related to students, there's a tendency to want to adopt policies that everyone else adopts in order to ensure the legality and the I guess you could call it like a protection. Like you just want to make sure you're not doing something that could imperil the school district in some way. And what I want to assure the board is that the policies that you see before you have been forwarded to our legal counsel and have been vetted and analyzed. But we're undertaking work that other school districts don't. Basically, they don't do. They are content to have the board policies that are kind of the garden variety board policies that every district uses. And you can almost do it verbatim. Some districts will actually take the recommended board policies that the California School Board Association publishes. And if you look on their board policy, on their board documents, they'll sometimes say approved recommended CSBA policies, and they'll just list them on one item, and it'll be like 75 board policies. So you have to ask, like, how much did we look at it? Like, what kind of equity work went into it? What kind of like you're adopting policies that say things about high schools, but you're a K-8, you know, there's just all of those kind of weird little, you know, perchances and situations that come up. And what you all are doing as a board, if you choose to adopt any of these proposed changes, you're going against the current. You're saying, when we read the conduct policy, we felt it was missing something. And this is what we felt it was missing. We felt it included things that needed to be taken out. And that's ultimately what this process is about. It's about making these board policies unique to the San Mateo-Foster City School District to accomplish our goals of having healthy, vibrant, safe, engaging school communities. So I wanted to start there. I want to pause for a minute to ask any board member for any clarification on the table itself or the selected policies before we start to dig into the policies themselves.
Okay. Can you clarify under the table here that we have discipline, bullying, conduct, and questioning by apprehension by law enforcement. The sections in green, light green, weapons and dangerous instruments and suspension, expulsion, due process. We don't have that today. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that in case I was missing something. Additionally, can you go over like sort of the hierarchy of like, and this is sort of maybe like a board policy 101 here is, my understanding is there's the board policy, which is more policy, and then the administrative regulations is more implementation per se. Is that right? Or
That's right, yeah. There's board policies statewide are, it's not a one-to-one match. So you'll go to some school districts and they'll have a board policy and they won't have an administrative regulation for that board policy. And then you'll go to some districts where they'll always have a board policy and an administrative regulation. We're in that first camp. Some of our board policies, we don't have administrative regulations. What that means is the board years ago adopted policies and the administration didn't take the policy and turn it into an administrative regulation. Sometimes they do that, Trustee Chin, because they feel that the board policy is clear enough so as to not need an administrative regulation. So sometimes the function of the administrative regulation is to provide clarity to practitioners. The board policy can be thought of as the public statement of intent and vision of the school board relative to the item. So like if it's like chronic truancy, the board policy is going to have the language that defines our approach to it and our beliefs about it. And the administrative regulation is going to say, what do we do when a student is chronically absent?
All right, thank you. And then the last question I have clarifying is you mentioned legal. It's my understanding that, just like you had mentioned, a lot of jurisdictions will just basically adopt CSBA's, standard, board regulations or policies, and here it is. And that always is reviewed by legal counsel. And so when we finally approve any of these changes, will our changes be reviewed before legal counsel to make sure they're all in compliance?
They've been reviewed before I'll bring them to the board.
Even if after we make any substantive changes?
We'll take them back to the.
Thank you.
And the reason for that is I don't want to put language before the board that legal will object to after the fact. And what their analysis is, if you take a look at, I don't know how excited you folks get about the specific language in a board policy, but if you just look at board policy 5131, you'll see examples in there that specifically refer to, they'll list it there as C.F. And then look at the very end and you'll see alignments to civil code, penal code, vehicle code, code of regulation. So there's a whole legal aspect to acknowledging that these policies and administrative regulations are referred to in these other places. So like, there was an instance a few years ago where a school district wanted to eliminate the dress and grooming policy. Like there was a desire by this one school district to say, why are we focusing on how kids dress? Well, their legal told them there is language in the civil code that requires school district, and it's old language, but it requires school districts to address this particular concern. And you actually can't get rid of the policy. If you do, you could be in trouble as a board of not having appropriate policy to address this, civil code. So that's a lot of the analysis that they do. They wouldn't comment on any of the, if you want to call vision or strategy aspects of it. It's more the alignment with other legal codes.
Thank you. Yeah. Question, second.
I don't have any questions, but before we dig into the nuances of all the policies, I'm just really grateful that we're having this conversation. And I feel like we've talked about these for a long time. To Randy's point, she, this is something she brought up, and then this came up again in the school to prison pipeline. And so I'm just, and I know, it's something that we've been trying to get to this place where we're having this conversation. And so just really grateful to you for pushing this forward, to all the staff that's worked on it. And I'm the liaison with Equity Task Force, so I've seen their communications around this, and they've had an opportunity to dig into these, to give feedback and input, and those conversations have been really powerful and impactful, and I feel like they've brought a lot to the table, and that's been incorporated into these drafts as well, which I just think is another important thing to consider. So yeah, I mean, this is the work, right? So I'm really glad that we're digging into these today. So just kind of wanted to say that before we actually dig into the nitty-gritty of the policies.
Trustee Watkins, I think it's been 4 separate meetings that we dealt with these policies. What will happen is our district staff, Dennis and David and Dr. Ledia, will meet probably 3 weeks in advance. Each week they'll spend about 1.5 hours to 2 hours on just one policy. Then that one policy looks kind of like you see it here, bolded with some strikeouts. And then they actually take that, they share this with the Equity Task Force, which meets typically for 1 hour to 1.5 hours in the evening once a month. It's usually a Monday. Trustee Watkins is there. We have a team of parents, community members, and educators that are there. And they basically go paragraph by paragraph, reading the whole thing, giving their viewpoint on how this language either aligns to what we years ago put into our resolution, or what might be a more effective practice, or even sometimes how it's being interpreted, what was written. Not just, it's great to add that, but what is the person who reads this going to think is the intent of this? So it actually gets, to me, it gets beyond just like saying we like where this is headed. It's like very deep conversation about saying like, hey, you know, what is Joe Q, assistant principal, gonna think we mean if we add this sentence? So I just want to elevate how rich the conversation has been. After that happens, David Chambliss is in the meeting taking notes, and they reconvene, Dr. Heredia, David, and Dennis a week later, and give a version of this, an updated version with the, that's why you see the ETF feedback listed under the ones that you see today. I think it's been a really great process.
Well, the other thing, just to point out, the other thing I wanted to quick say is, you know, the policies that we pulled out in the school business pipeline resolution were only, I think it was only one or two. And then the team was like, hold on, this impacts all of these. And so I just also appreciate the thoroughness, you know, of really thinking about like where all of the places where this intersects and overlaps and bringing all of them. And while it's going to take longer, it's just better, and it's going to be more impactful, and it's, you know, it means that we're not leaving anything out as we're thinking about all of the policies that have connections or impacts with discipline and student support and all of those. So yeah.
We want to be especially aware of things like the last ones on the list that I read earlier: dress and grooming and bus conduct. You're like, what does this have to do with school to prison pipeline? But if your bus conduct says suspend kids from the bus because they misbehave, then we've got kids that aren't going to school. Like in this district, if you can't get on the bus, you're actually not going to be able to get to school in a lot of cases. So let's dig into that policy and find out what we do in lieu of separating a student from their education. In a non-San Mateo-Foster City School District setting, a bus might be a convenience, like, yeah, I'll jump on the bus. It's, you know, down Broadway Street. But if you tell me, like, if you get me in trouble, so you can't be on the bus for 2 days, my mom can still take me to school, or I can just walk to school. Here, you can't walk from North Central to Highlands. That's not gonna happen. So that's an example of what Trustee Watkins just pointed out. Like, it's about being very comprehensive about what might intersect with the school to prison pipeline, and then dress and grooming is the same. Like, if I interpret a child wearing a hood with their a hooded sweatshirt as gang behavior, and that's in my dress and grooming policy, then this is the Bay Area, folks. These kids wear hoodies a lot. This is not, you know, Central California where like kids are not going to wear that clothing because it's super hot. So here you've got a lot of kids who, if your policy doesn't read the right way, you might route them into discipline without thinking about the impact of how that dress code is being interpreted, or a certain color or a certain type of clothing. So it's about thinking about how all of those policies intersect with the school district pipeline. Yeah.
I wanted to add, you know, this makes me think about just like different, I remember this was probably like 2018 when I learned that we had principals, even 5th grade principals, taking away graduation from kids for certain discipline issues that did not warrant suspensions or expulsion. And, you know, I heard from a mom about how much of a negative impact that had on one of her children, who then went on to middle school and just navigated the way that he interacted at school in a very different way after that happened. And so those kinds of impacts are something that I think this board we've had on our minds for many years. And when that happened, I remember I got the chance to come to like a leadership meeting and talk to the principals and basically share why I didn't feel like that was appropriate, but it was just talk, right? Like it wasn't actually a change in board policy. It wasn't actually a change in administrative regulations. And then that means that, you know, the next year when I learned about another similar situation, even as a board member, I didn't feel like I had the recourse to actually like protect kids from this type of discipline that, you know, there's no way to know if it's applied fairly or equitably. And I will tell you that even recently, I have learned that, you know, from a parent that there have been comments made about parents' appearances and looking like a thug, and about, you know, how does your child have such expensive clothing, and that's really like people don't feel proud about sharing those types of stories, and it's difficult to hear them and difficult to know that these types of microaggressions, I'm gonna call them what they are still happening, and that we still have work to do. And you know, it happens everywhere, but it should not be happening at our schools. And I think this is the kind of, like, you think it just lives on a piece of paper, right? But it doesn't, because it translates to everything else in our school. And so I'm excited about making these updates and changes, because this is about accountability and transparency and making sure that our students are empowered and really in a safe place when they're at school, no matter what background they have or where they come from. So yeah, and I haven't actually shared that one piece yet, so I will talk with people about that. But yeah, just about what I learned recently. So much going on, but I do think that we want families to be able to come and tell us their stories, and we want to be able to feel like, you know, like there's justice even in our educational system, right?
I would ask also, not only do we look at this from a racial equity standpoint, but also from a disability equity standpoint as well. You know, there's a lot that happens with people with disabilities, especially some of our developmental disabilities such as autism, where the behavior appears to be going against some of these policies and needs to be dealt with. But then when you delve a little deeper, you find out that there's some anxiety related to it. There's something that behind, or a different cause. It's a manifestation determination of, you know, determining if the behavior is part of the disability. So I just hope that as we review these policies, not only do we keep the racial equity in mind, but we also keep the disability equity in mind as well, and create policies and, you know, address policies and things that from that point of view as well. I feel like that's just as important.
I just want to clarify, I didn't actually say anything about race, but I agree that we definitely need to prioritize that also.
What we're gonna do for the next couple of minutes is we have 4 policies that are actually ready to go to the school board on May 12th. These would be policies that you all read for the first time at a regular board meeting on May 12th, and that I would recommend the board consider for adoption at the May 26th board meeting. the first of which is conduct. So what I want to do today in this session is to give us each about 5 minutes to read conduct, which is board policy 5131. And for the board to go through an exercise, what do we notice and what do we wonder? And just each of us on the team, if you don't have a notice and a wonder, that's okay, but that's how I want to frame our conversation today. What do we notice about the policy and what do we wonder about the policy? And then we'll repeat it for discipline and for questioning. Does that sound fair? Let's do that. It is 1:34, so we're gonna give ourselves until 1:39.
Superintendent Choa, go ahead.
Thank you. So what I find, I'm gonna start us off, and then on each next round, I'll pass it to somebody else on the team to get started. What stood out to me, what I noticed was right off the bat, a comment that Trustee Corzo made just a few minutes ago. When I read the original version of this policy, which is the non-bolded, non-struck out content, it says, the Board of Trustees believes that students have a right to be educated in an environment free from disruption, and that students shall be expected to exhibit appropriate conduct. In other words, in the current policy, it defines what the board believes should happen, and it goes immediately to what students are supposed to do to achieve it. And it's missing the sentence in between, which is the board further believes that positive student conduct relies on school personnel building relationships with students and families. So if I disrespect our families, if I ask them questions about how they dress or why they dress a certain way or how they look, then I can't participate in this. But at the same time, on the third page, there's a whole paragraph that specifically delineates how our district is going to take the extra step to see if behavior has any relationship to disability, to not interpret behavior without thinking about whether or not the child whose behavior is being evaluated or whose conduct is being considered has special needs or has a plan that defines what supports we should be giving. So it's just kind of interesting because it was sort of directly related to something you both just finished talking about. Not necessarily exactly what you were talking about, but that's what I noticed. That's my notice. And then I'll pass it to you, Trustee Corzo, for any notice or wonder.
Yeah, I also noticed that it goes beyond just talking about disability, but also a physical, emotional, or cognitive condition that, and it's like indicative of that, right? It's not even like, oh, have they been completely diagnosed? But it's like, you know, could it like, so that's my wonder. Wait, I don't know, is that a wonder?
I think it's both. It's a notice and a wonder.
Okay.
President Proctor.
So I noticed in the first paragraph that students have been changed to all members of the school community, which I think is important to express that this actually, although going down below where it talks about prohibited student conduct, we're really starting with that this is an expectation of everybody. And so I think that's really important. And I'm glad that we've included that. I also was wondering that in the first page, it talks about that each school develops a standards of conduct. And just curious curious what that would look like for different schools and why they would be different or the same, or, you know, that kind of thing. So that's what I wondered.
Tracy, want this?
So I had a similar noticing around just the embedded focus around the role that we have at all levels of the school environment to impact student conduct, right? It's not like students solely are responsible for their conduct. We actually impact that by all of these other things at all levels. And I feel like that's really important for, you know, everyone to take ownership of that. And then my wondering is around, and I don't know exactly where, but is there a way to include almost like checks and balances on possible bias in interpretation of student context? So when I read the paragraph around, you know, checking in with Aries, I mean, maybe this is where that an administrator, but to see if it's disability related, it made me think about a story I recently heard about a parent whose student was going to be referred, happened to be a young boy of color who, a young brown boy who, you know, they were really concerned about the way that an educator was interpreting the student's behavior. And, you know, I had a conversation with them and encouraged them to speak with their school principal, who then did an observation. And, you know, so there was kind of this checks and balance in place that then led to like, actually, we don't think that needs to happen. And there's something else kind of that we need to adjust here, but I'm wondering like where that might fit in here so that there isn't like a, I don't know, there's some sort of checks and balances before we're immediately referring a student for an SST or, you know, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so, you know, when I did my first read through of this, I really appreciated how it goes along with our strategic goal of educating a whole child. So I really feel like we are addressing, you know, whole child needs in looking at this. You know, we're starting to look at, you know, what is the reason for the behavior? What is the reason for the conduct? We're not just like, here's a conduct, here's how we deal with it. I too share the same concern that Trustee Proctor has in terms of, you know, what exactly does it mean that each school develops their own standard of conduct? How much standardization would, you know, be good? And then, of course, understanding that each school does have their own flavor, essentially, you know, for lack of a better way of putting it. And that certain schools, you know, a certain way something is written may not work as well. And so like there might need to be some small changes to reflect that particular school. But, you know, I just would like, I'm just curious to see what that would look like. You know, when we talk about further down on that same page with discrimination, harassment, intimidation, and bullying, I think I'd like to see more verbiage around abilities and disabilities as well, so that again we don't lose sight of that. And then also, you know, I see a lot of potential for needing to go into, you know, the IEPs and manifestations. I don't know how many manifestation hearings we have currently in our district, but you know, like, for example, you know, we're talking about failure to remain on school premises with accordance of school rules. You know, elopement is very common in autism, and it's usually a function of escape from anxiety. So I just want to make sure that we're addressing that as well. And also knowing that the IEP, you know, while everybody who's involved with a child does, I feel should be informed of the IEP so that everybody is aware of, you know, what supports are needed to avoid a conduct issue. I'm also concerned with the privacy aspect and just who can access it in that part of areas. That would just be something that I would be concerned about. And maybe that's just a broader disability issue as opposed to a necessarily a conduct issue, but, you know, I would hate to have, you know, privacy being violated in the process as well.
So part of my question about, and this is an overall notice when I read through these, is the distinction and the clarification between board policies and administrative regulations. Part of the issue is that what it seems like is that we sort of blur the lines between the two, where we have policy, but also sort of implementation in the policies sort of statements. And so what that does do is that kind of makes it slightly confusing for anyone who's trying to implement it, because they have to go both to the board policies and the administrative regulation. So that's overall as a notice, it seems as we've made these corrections that we've kind of blurred the lines, and I just wanted to bring that up. As an example, I'll explain one later on down on page maybe 5 or 6. But as an overall wonder, I wonder why the laser pointer was removed from something I shouldn't have on campus. And so I was curious of why that was removed. I also, when we talked about inappropriate hire, I wonder, because this is one where it's very clear that talks about board policy and administrative regulation about this. You talked about, you know, hoods in classrooms and everything else. That does happen on campus. And I know that I've had issues sort of with that. And so I kind of sort of wonder about, you know, what is that line between wearing things that are appropriate and not appropriate? Because people take things differently in different ways. And so I kind of wonder about that. I also wonder when it talks about to remaining on campus, this is sort of where it sort of blurs the line between noticing, between policy and implementation. This is under sort of failure to remain school number 10, but it's under the open closed campus. This is the first paragraph is fine. It doesn't talk about sort of or actually, I feel like we're missing an elopement section, because the elopements that we've had, as Trustee Warren mentioned, have related to special needs students. And so the paragraph here is great that it's been added, but I kind of feel like that is like part of, should be for like in an administrative regulation. Like these are the steps, this is what we do. It's great to identify it here, or maybe add something else that has to refer to that, but it feels very like these are the steps we have to take. And I'm okay with that if we didn't have an administrative regulation on it, but I do kind of feel like people have to look at two different things. And the reason why I also bring that up in other cases that we have a change on, I think, discipline, where there's actually a conflicting statement between the administrative regulation and the board policy. And so when I look at this, I wonder whether or not, you know, are we sort of being consistent in some ways. The last sort of notice or wonder is when it comes down to the search and seizure down below. There was a case in our area, I think it was in the South Bay, where school district officials were trying to regulate some sort of content on an individual student's device, but the student was off campus per se, and it wasn't done on campus. It related to school stuff. But there's a section in here, a line that says this also applies to off-campus conduct during non-school hours, which pose a threat or danger to the safety of students. Like legally, I wonder how this is sort of interpreted, because nowadays, you know, it's one thing if it's like on our school Chromebooks. It's another thing if it's, let's say, 8 or 9 o'clock at night and the students at home in their room. You know, where is that line drawn between student conduct and search and seizure throughout the day? You know, obviously this is sort of relates to, like, let's just say if you're, you know, on campus and you're, you know, maybe, or if you're at an extracurricular activity, and that makes a lot of sense. But when this kind of blurs that line, and I don't know where that is, so that's why I'd love to have some sort of technical analysis on that because it's a big wonder. That's all I have on this section. Thank you.
I've got 6 items I want to follow up on. The first is why would a discipline policy for a school A be different than school B? Something that's happening at the same time as these board policies are being reviewed is that the school district is working on a discipline matrix. A discipline matrix you could think of as like the recipe, like we're all going to make mashed potatoes and we all have a recipe. But, you know, I'm one of those wacky people. I like coconut oil more than olive oil. You're going to use vegetable oil because you like we're going to eat mashed potatoes, but like we're just going to use a little bit different seasonings. We were just at Parkside Montessori. Remember what the kids were doing outside the classrooms? They were just like eating. Like at 14 of our other elementary schools, that would not be permitted to take place. Like at 14 other elementary schools, kids aren't walking outside and saying, I don't recall who was standing next to me when I said, but they were like, I'll be having my snack for the next half hour. One of us was talking about at that school, you're allowed to basically decide how long you eat your snack. It might be for you 7 minutes, for me it might be 30 minutes. But the adults trust the children to make that decision. And pretty much I think the idea is like the kids get back in class. So their discipline policy can't have anything in it that refers to like not being in the right place at the right time because that school doesn't operate. Second question was about checks and balances. So one of the policies that's coming down the line is the policy related to multi-tiered systems of support. Because we want to have very clear codified checks and balances that we don't currently have. We actually don't have that district-specific multi-tiered systems of support policy that we believe is going to provide those very clear standard operating procedures of checks and balances to preclude the situation of behavior being interpreted by one adult. And often the behavior is interpreted differently by 2 adults, even in the same office. The school counselor might perceive it one way, and the school principal might perceive it another way, and the teacher might perceive it a third way. So what happens is you create a system within the school. We already have something pre-existing at almost all our elementary schools called a care team. But us building it into a system of support is what's missing, and that work is ahead of us. Trustee Warren, you asked about Aries access. What Aries will tell you is if a child has an IEP, or if a child has a 504, or if they're in process. It won't give you any access to the IEP itself. So you'll know that there's a plan, but you won't be able to access the plan in Aries. You would need to use our other system, which is SACE, and that requires password protected access. Laser pointer. I think the reason was because kids don't bring laser pointers. I'm going to assume that was the reason, because I think 10, 15 years ago, having a laser pointer was a very common thing. I'll double back with Dennis and David and Dr. Velia to, just get clarity about that, but I believe that's the reason. You pointed out, Trustee Chen, there's going to be a consistency issue we look at with discipline. Conduct is a little bit different. So if you'll notice, conduct is 5131, and then in your policy table, you'll see there are other policies that are 5131.1, 0.2, 0.3. So conduct is like the big dog. Conduct is the big one. There is no administrative reg for conduct. The administrative regs are all these smaller aspects of conduct, like I'm starting by that one right now. use of seclusion punishment or alcohol and other drugs. And so for that reason, conduct is gonna have some kind of AR style language in it, but that shouldn't really be the case with the others that are paired up, BP and AR. And then off-campus conduct. So in education, the standard for us to be able to address student behavior is whether or not the conduct had what they call a nexus to the school environment. So we all have cell phones. We're all in 8th grade together. You and I had a dispute. We're all in 8th grade together. We all go to the same school. He has a compromising picture of me. He goes home, says, haha, this Diego guy, such and such, look at this picture I have of Diego. Sends it to all of you who go to my school, who are in our class. I go to school and you tell me, I saw your picture, I saw your picture. I go to the office and say, I don't want to go to the school anymore. Everyone's laughing at me. When there's a nexus between the behavior that took place, even if you sent it at 9 p.m., but you're at home, what are those called? Air Max? I'm the not like a phone, but like a computer device. iPad, yeah, sorry. I was having a senior moment. Yeah. Then what happens is we'll find out about how that took place because the kids will tell us, and we're able to draw the through line between we had a dispute on Tuesday, you went home Tuesday night, sent that message. Now I'm the subject of bullying from other kids on campus. I don't want to go to the school anymore. You interfere with my right to get an education at this school because you chose to use electronic means at home in the evening to harm me, to create harm. So that's the nexus of it. That's a particularly common example, actually. The other examples, like we have a dispute, we agree we're going to go fight at the corner. Fight happened because we had the dispute on campus. 16 people saw it. We're both in the trouble.
So just to clarify, because this is under the section of search and seizure, the issue is if that student has it on their own iPad, are you saying the school district has the right to go in and claim and take possession of that iPad? Because that's kind of the message that sort of sends here in this section.
We have a right, if I think, will you read specifically the sentence of your?
So when any student, any prohibited device, district employee may confiscate the device. And so this, to me, sounds like if it's on campus, right, which makes sense, right? But when it goes off to the second paragraph, students who struggle to meet district conduct expectations or follow school rules and regulations may be referred to intervention supports. This also applies to off-campus conduct during non-school hours. So to me, I think this could be clearer because, what I don't want us to get into is any legal aspects or issues of personal property versus, even if it applies to school district stuff.
So the sentence that you read indicating when students have a prohibited device, adults are authorized to confiscate the device. So the prohibited device, the prohibited electronic device being confiscated is, and the subsequent paragraph, which is, this paragraph is being added for a couple of reasons. The first is that when students have behavioral incidents that recur, more than one incident, and the reason to include the sentence about it applying to off-campus conduct is because so much of the conduct we deal with in school is related to conduct that takes place off of campus, especially at our middle schools. This is not very common at all at our K-5s, right? But what the paragraph continues to say is that we're deprioritizing the tendency, the reflex to want to implement punitive actions unless and until we have proof that we have documented restorative act and non-punitive means which have failed to bring about proper time. It's kind of like, it's a paragraph being added to make sure that our practitioners understand. Diego's gotten in trouble 4 times, but you're not just going to suspend me every single time I get in trouble from this point forward. There's an expectation that our practices attempt to correct my behavior without using exclusionary and punitive measures as the sole strategy to achieve that change. So I see where you're coming from. I want to think about it a little more. I didn't read it that way, but I think that's another reason why it's so important for us not to adopt policies on the day we present them to the board, but rather take this through a solid 30-day public process, so that questions like those that are brought forth, Trustee Cheng can be looked at. Okay. Board policy 5144 discipline. It is 2:04. We are going to go through our second notice and wonder activity at 2:09. Trustee Forsley, you will be first.
Just the board policy.
Just the board policy. BP. Board policy 5144. Started. Notice. Different colors. 209. Trustee Corsley, you want to get us started?
Sure thing.
Notice and wonder.
Okay. So I noticed that it refers to the discipline and intervention matrix, but it also says that the site level teams must consult this guidance, but it doesn't say that they have to like adhere to the guidance. So that this is my notice, and then something that I wonder is, and I want to be clear, like I actually like that this is worded this way because it is clear, but on, oh, it doesn't have page number, but under retaining students after school, it says students may not be detained. And I think it's interesting that before it was okay to detain students. And then, like, when you think about the word detained, like, it's very like law enforcement type of language. But it also clarifies that it is a punitive consequence for behavior and that it cannot be done without 24-hour notice to student's parent or guardian. And I think about all of the kids on the bus. And this actually happened to my own sister in our school district, where she was detained at the school, actually by a school resource officer, until like 6 p.m. at night. And she took the bus home. So that meant that, you know, we had to, my mom had to get there to the school.
And those are 3 pretty horrible hours of not knowing what. President Foster.
So what I noticed and like about this is that some of the language that's being used, including that we want all students to feel accepted, supported, and respected, and that this policy is we would like to maximize instructional time for students. I think like this kind of goes in line with all of the things that we are we're trying to do better academically. We need students in classrooms, not at home or in the office or wherever they are. And then I like that some of the where discipline has been like reworded, and like one of them is responses to student behavior rather than discipline. And there's a couple other areas. So I do like all that. Not like specific to this policy, but where it talks about minor behavior. I had some wonderings just in terms of what's considered a dress code violation and why we would ever give zeros on assignments. I think it's really damaging to students, not just that cheat and they drive, but just in general. So those are my wonderings.
Some noticings I had, just, you know, that there's a real focus, and I think this is across all of these policies on restorative practices, on naming and talking about inequity, you know, gaps, naming the school to prison pipeline, just like really being, you know, pulling in both from the resolution and just kind of our work as a board, and bringing that into these policies. So notice and really appreciate that. I also noticed I don't remember where it is, but including kind of the data analysis of trends. So, you know, on an annual basis where we're able to really think about the impacts of some of these policies and procedures. And so by, you know, having the superintendent bring that information to the board and discussing it. So notice and appreciate that. A couple wonderings. One was, so I know that in the resolution, there was the addition of kind of naming the minor behavior that is not subject to exclusionary discipline. I was wondering, I don't necessarily have a thought, but wondering, I don't know if I missed it, but naming specifically the major, I don't know if you call it major behavior, or do we want to also be like really explicit about what are the things that do warrant that? I just wonder. The other thing that I wondered a little bit about is, and I don't know, I didn't have a chance to go through the AR to see if it's included in here, but almost like the steps for disciplinary action, right? So in the resolution, it talks about reducing referrals and suspensions and other things that we do, and minimizing contact with law enforcement. But, and again, maybe it lives in the AR, but I'm almost wondering, like, is this a place for like really spelling out what that looks like? And if you do need to contact law enforcement, this is who you contact first before you do that. How does all of that kind of work, and is there clarity? And again, I know that there's some nuance in terms of like what's implementation, what's policy, what's BP, what's AR. I'm just kind of wondering, I guess, where that fits, and wanting that to be really explicit around having consistency, specifically around when we move to things like expulsion, suspension, calling police to campus, like some of those bigger actions, and all the things that we expect to happen first.
So one of the things that struck me when I first started going through, like that top paragraph that struck out, comparing it to the paragraph right below it, what I really appreciate about this policy is we're not talking about the environment. We're talking about how we're preparing students, and we're wanting to prepare students to be caring, competent, and critical thinkers, fully engaged, fully informed, engaged, contributing members of society. What we had previously is we were providing a safe, supportive, and positive school environment, which is important, but I don't feel like that's necessarily aligned with our strategic goals of, educating the children. I like the idea of minimizing punitive discipline and maximizing instructional time, because again, that's very much aligned with our strategic goals. I also appreciate on the top of the third page where in the paragraph where we talk about disrupting the school to prison pipeline and the expectation that all schools, all 21 schools will enforce the discipline rules fairly, consistently, and without discrimination. I really feel like it's important to make sure to just set that expectation out there. And also just actually going back, I totally missed over or skipped over one of my notes that I made here, is when we talk about the superintendent or designee will develop or shall develop effective age appropriate strategies. I kind of feel like maybe I feel like a better choice of words may be developmentally appropriate, because I think that takes into account students with developmental disabilities or ADHD and other things that they may be chronologically one age, but developmentally another, or function at a different level. Also, when I'm looking at these minor behavior infractions, I would love to see a little bit more, tying back to the potential for looking at kids with IEPs. Because some of these, like dress code violation, you could have a kid with autism, but he can only wear a certain thing for sensory issues. So, I can see that one potentially coming into play. So if there could just be some sort of tie-in back to, let's refer back to an IEP, on a case-by-case basis, I think that would be really helpful in terms of disabilities. So anyway, that's my take. Wonders and notices.
So my notice ties me back to what Trustee Corzo had said at one point about detainment. And the idea is that, what I notice is that what's great about this process is, in my mind, there's sort of legacy language in some ways, whether it's CSBA language or whether it's language that's been here for like 30+ years. And that what we're doing, which is great, is changing that language, removing it, or, so that it is probably current to today's times and even current to our board thoughts and the district's thoughts. So that overall is a great sort of notice, because I think it's very valuable as we go through this. Because there is language, I think when we used to go through these board policies, when we would do this every year, we'd come across something that was, in the 1970s or something that hadn't been updated. And so the idea is that it's important to kind of go through these all the time. My wonder, there's a few wonders. One, there's reference about the discipline matrix. I know that's in here. I know that we're working on it, but we haven't seen it yet. And so my thought is that, are we, the timing of this, are we approving a board policy before we approve the matrix? Okay, thank you. Because that was my wonder, or one wonder. The other wonder is, the minor behavior. I'm okay with it here. I'd love some additional clarifications, just like my other board members. The one thing is, like, it does feel like there's not a lot of room for interpretation. Like, there's a lot of things, whether it's, special needs or whether it's something else. I feel like there should be a line in here that, talks about, not case by case, but that gives a little bit of openness. Because as this sort of conflicts or relates, like the #1 cell phone usage to what we talked about earlier, conduct, it feels like there could be some gray in there. My last wonder is about the LCAP and the budget. So again, this is sort of blurring the lines between sort of policy and implementation. I'm okay with the fact that it talks about the LCAP shall include disaggregated analysis and patterns there. But then the last line says, using these analysis, the superintendent or designee shall do this. And it feels like that's more of an implementation section. I don't necessarily know if it's the right place for this. Because when I think about the LCAP and think about what we do with the LCAP, I don't necessarily go to the board policies for instructions of what it is, or what we need to do. So that's my thought, but I could go either way. I just wonder about that. So that's it for me.
I have 7 follow-ups. I think we want to have a policy that reflects the board's intention. So I want to just check in with other board members about the idea of using language like adhere to as opposed to consult with. Trustee Corzo pointed out there's a section in here that says, like, you're going to consult with the discipline matrix, the district's discipline matrix. But if we're going to take the discipline matrix through a multi-meeting process with this board, we don't want 21 schools just looking at it. We want them to follow. Is it fair to say that we're solid on that?
Yes.
Yep.
President Proctor, you pointed out instructional time. That's a huge part of what this is about. When you keep separating kids from school, you make the job of everybody in the system harder. The parent has a new issue at home, the child isn't learning, the teacher has to figure out how to make up that time with the kid. It just really interferes with the educational process. I think what Vice President Watkins, you pointed out major behaviors. I think when the board sees the discipline matrix, which will be presented to you on May 12th, next Thursday, I think that's the right place for it. And AR 5144 discipline, which we're going to look at next, specifically calls it out. There's a narrowness of the way the physical outlook of these board policies. It's sort of in Times New Roman, it's got a lot of legalese in there. So the nice thing about a discipline matrix is we've got it in a nice chart. It flows really easily. We can do some color coding. When you see the discipline matrix, I think you'll feel good about it being very specific about what behaviors would potentially lead to a suspension and under what circumstances.
Can I just ask a follow-up?
Yes.
I'm just curious the rationale behind including minor and like, I get that. And so then what was kind of the thinking behind including those here? Or are you recommending that those be taken out? And like, I almost wonder if these are taken out then, and then it's reference the discipline matrix for more information about minor and major or something like that.
Data. The reason we decided to leave these in is you're looking at things that kids have been suspended for. So we took it as like, let's just call it out. We are not suspending for these reasons. And it was a much, I mean, the suspendable offenses list is really long. It's like there's, you know, under the 48,900 code, that's a suspension code. It goes from A to K. I would not want to list, I would feel like it's going in the wrong direction to list all those possible reasons. But it's kind of sad to think about like kids being suspended for like copying, right? Some of us may have never finished high school if that happened. Right, like copying leading to suspension. Yeah, the sad thing is we all thought I was talking about, each one of us thought that it was in reference to us, but that was the thinking behind it.
Got it.
Specifics related to those discipline responses are included in that matrix, which we're going to see next Thursday night. I do actually like the phrase developmentally appropriate for a couple of reasons. I think, especially because we're becoming a PK8 district, not a, right? Not just, we're trying to think more of ourselves along the PK continuum, and we have some inclusion work that's happening, and we're going to have to reformat ourselves to not think about age, but think about developmental progress. And it's 1 out of every 10 kids we talk about. So to me, I do like the idea of using that developmentally appropriate as opposed to age appropriate. What do the rest of the board think of that?
I think it's okay. I guess the question is like, how do you define developmental? Because like, what if you're a sixth grader, you're like a big mature boy, like, you know, would you be more punished because like maybe you're like more mature or more, I don't know, like puberty or whatever, you know, like you're just
Right.
different than the other sixth graders, or vice versa, you're a little immature, and so I just want to know the definition of how we're.
Can I say something? So the way that we look at this and at like Golden Gate Regional, so for example, it's like you're developmentally like your birth age unless you have an assessment that says otherwise. And so, and that like, I don't know, that's kind of how we look at it. But that's a really good point that you brought up. So that would have to be super clear.
The interpretation of the conduct is one aspect of the developmental appropriateness. So like if you have a child who has a 4-year delay in their pragmatic development, like I might walk into a room as a 6-year-old and, you know, run around the room and grab the pens, and then like a 10-year-old is not going to do it. Like a 10-year-old is going to sort of look around the room, figure out like, okay, there's some chairs here, let me sit down. So I'm not going to get a 10-year-old in trouble who does what a 6-year-old would do, because I'm aware that in this case, as Trustee Corzo pointed out, because I have a disability, that's part of who I am as an individual. On the flip side, to address what you pointed out, this same 10-year-old who runs in and grabs the markers and starts drawing, it wouldn't be appropriate for that student to be brought into like a restorative conference yet, because they won't get out of that like one-on-one restorative counseling conference what a typical developing 10-year-old might. So you might use a different strategy to work with the student to understand how the behavior that they said. That makes sense. So it's on both ends. It's like on the interpretation of the behavior, and it's also in the response to the behavior that the developmental appropriateness would be perceived or would be implemented by us. May 12th is our opportunity to look at that discipline matrix. And then Trustee Chen, I was looking for the reference to the LCAP. Could you point out for me? I just didn't want to skip over. I
Yeah.
wanted to see where it
It's
landed.
the very last section of the,
Each year, the superintendent shall report to the board regarding strategies used and consider their effect. Disaggregated. Devising recommendations
Yeah.
to ensure discipline.
Yeah.
Disciplinary approaches maximize student health, well-being, and opportunity.
Yeah.
Oh, you're talking about the legal reference. the
Yeah.
CF.
no, I mean, so the paragraph that's added is in bold, right? So, yeah, so when it talks about, oh, we're not talking about the LCAP, thank you, yeah, no, it's the CF reference.
Gotcha.
Thank you,
I just want to make sure,
Yeah,
I
thank
didn't
you.
want to misinterpret.
yep, thank you for that. I missed that part, yeah.
AR 5144 and President Proctor, when we take, after we're done with our 5 minutes, would you read this and that one?
Yeah.
Okay. We just have one more after.
It's almost the same. Oh. Oh, that's.
You jump, you
We
jump.
already read that one?
Yeah, she jumped.
Oh,
Sorry, which one are we doing?
AR.
Administrative
Yeah,
red.
yeah. Wow, no.
We'll give you another one.
We have both of the bullet.
You're just being advanced.
We have the BP and the AR. You'll do the-
Yeah, but I'm also gonna do.
But are we, so we're not gonna get to bullying then?
Questioning and apprehension. Bullying is actually not going to be presented to the board of the law. It's going to go for the first read on the 26th.
Okay, this is the only one we're doing this. Okay.
So we're doing BP,
Yeah.
sorry, we're doing AR
Yeah.
5144, and then questioning and apprehension.
Okay.
I included bullying because I wanted to show the timing in the
Sure.
sequence.
Yep.
But it'll come to you all for the first time on the 26th for possible approval in June. President Proctor. Lead us off.
Okay, so a couple of things that I've noticed that I really like about this is that the paragraph that talks about recess restriction, and I think that for a lot of students, recess and lunch may be their favorite part of school, and so I'm glad that we're basically saying that's not okay to restrict those times. The other one is about community service, and I think for me, this one sentence, or at least these couple of words that talk about it may not be designed to demean or shame the student. I think that applies to all types of discipline, and I feel very strongly about that. I cannot express that enough. When I was in middle school, I think if you got in trouble, you had to pick up trash at lunchtime. These like grabber things, and kids got laughed at. People purposely threw garbage at them and on the ground. So I like that part. My wondering is about the section that talks about representatives from the schools and how like parents or I guess teachers, how they get chosen for this little committee or whatever it is, making sure that we have voices of all different types of people. And I know it's called out for students. And I really like that too.
Similar noticings around, I'm really appreciating the recess restriction piece, wondering, I know there was lunch or food, and I don't know if it was in the board policy or the conduct policy, but I do wonder about specifically naming that as well. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but that food cannot be withheld, or lunchtime cannot be removed, those sorts of things as well. And appreciate the community service piece as well. Those were two pieces I had. I also, this is both a noticing and that moves then into a wondering. I appreciate the addition here around kind of students with IEPs and the need to look into a student's IEP when thinking about appropriate response. I appreciated in the board policy, there was specific mention around inequity and bias and school to prison pipeline. And I wonder if there's a way to incorporate some of that language here, that we're thinking about special attention to our groups of students that have historically experienced bias, and just calling that out again. I'm wondering if that's something that we could think about incorporating into this regulation as well. And then I had a question around, I like your point, Allison, about the group and how that's decided. Later on there, it talks about the site level discipline, that it should be reviewed annually and updated. And my question was, who's responsible for doing that? And can we name that? Is it this team? Is it just a principal? Who's kind of responsible for that? Who oversees that? I know a copy is filed with you, but wondering about that.
Okay, I also had similar thoughts to my other two colleagues on the board. I do appreciate the fact that, it is explicitly stated that each school is expected to incorporate MTSS framework into disciplinary approach. There's no room for interpretation there. If you're a school in our school district, you will be implementing this. I like the fact about including the student voice in the development of school policy and practice that both benefits students and schools, and recognizing that the students are the largest stakeholder in the school community. And a lot of times, what I've found is peers tend to be the harshest critics of, and people actually tend to be the harshest critics of their own behaviors too. So I think that can actually, help guide quite a bit. I like the idea of annual review of these discipline rules and guidance and support. I'm going to echo what Trustee Watkins and President Proctor asked about, who's doing the reviewing. Will parents be included in the review as well? Another thing that I was also grateful for is no recess restriction. We are, some of these behaviors that we're looking at disciplining, fall under ADHD, or other developmental disabilities where they need to be outside. That is not something that's appropriate to take away. So I appreciate the idea that we are looking at that, and also the fact that we are recognizing that it is a time to take care of basic physiologic needs, such as getting a drink, eating a snack, going to the bathroom, or eating lunch. One thing I did have a wondering on was when we're talking about retaining students after school, is why the strike through on certificated district employee during after school restorative or academic support. I just, knowing that our certificated staff includes like psychologists and counselors, if we're looking at there being a potential for those groups of people to be involved in this, I was just wondering why we would eliminate certificated, or just not replace the word with something more broad.
So my only wonder is actually about the recess restriction. I think I need some further education on why we would actually do this. I hear my other trustees in support of it. I don't know why. Why would we do it? Like actually restrict. I've seen it. I've been in classrooms, in our classrooms volunteering, where teachers have used it effectively. Not necessarily for students with special needs or anyone, but they do it in like 1 minute intervals. And so it's not the entire lunch or not entire recess, but it has been used effectively. So I just sort of wonder, and I just would love to know whether is it the research around it or what is it, so that I can be more informed on this, because I don't know, because it's not necessarily instructional time. It is social emotional learning time, which is good, but to me, it's not, it's sort of one of those things where when teachers are trying to get a handle on the classroom, I've seen it used effectively. So I don't know. I would love to be more informed on it. So that's my wonder on this section.
Okay, let's see. So because I had already looked at this one, I was going to say that I wonder for board policy, for the board policy on discipline, I wonder about how it will feel for, actually, there was another place. Oh, okay, here. I'm going to do both, okay? So on the AR, it says, it specifically calls out that students who participate in site level policies, student representatives should be demographically diverse and representative of the school community. I actually appreciate that, right? Because folks who are directly impacted should have, at the very least, some representation, and sometimes that's not the case. And then for this other one, I was wondering, because it explicitly states the board recognizes that an opportunity gap for significant portions of its student population exists, namely among African American, Latino, and English learner students and students with disabilities. I just like, and the board expects to identify and address the causes of this proportionate treatment. I'm really happy that's in there because I think sometimes people don't recognize that it's an opportunity gap, and so that's explicitly stated there. But I also wonder like how it will feel, because like, how do I say this? Sorry, I'm struggling with words, but many times I feel like there's this mindset that that's just the way that it is. But because it says we expect, as a board, expect to identify and address the causes of disproportionate treatment, I wonder how some teachers will take that. But I want to be clear, I want that there, and I think it's what we need to, I think it's perfect, but I just wonder, like,
And I'll start in reverse in my comments.
okay.
I think that many of our stakeholders, certificated, classified administrators, parents, and other community members are going to be very interested in the policies, the changes, the discussion around those. And all from different places. You'll actually hear from folks who say, you know, I have been wondering when a board would address this issue, when a board would be willing to say what you just pointed out. And others who say, I feel that this is attacking me because I've been a principal here for 12 years or a teacher for 25 years. I think the comprehensiveness of the work we're doing to take this through this process and the connection to research and educational best practice according to the state's movement, the state's adoption of multi-tiered systems of supports as a structure for California, I think really will help stakeholders who want to know more about, want to understand what it means to add language like that in there. But I also think others will need to see this in action to understand that this is not about blaming one group of people for something that happens to a different group of people, but it's really about systems change. And it's about thinking really deeply and carefully about how we prepare to keep kids in class and to keep kids engaged in school, which leads me to the question on recess restriction. A big part of the move away from recess restriction is data-based and research-based along the lines of the regularity of the recess restriction and the lack of controls around recess restriction. So like you'll have children whose recess is restricted almost on a daily basis. And that's the opposite of what you're describing. That like you might say like, hey, I'm going to keep you back for a minute because I want to talk to you. Yeah. That's like, if I teach you and I don't want to take away your recess, but I need to talk to you for a minute. Yeah. That's different than you just spoke again. You're not going to recess today. And actually, I'll tell you that at 9, knowing that recess isn't until 11 o'clock. And that's about control and dominance and fear. And we want that out of our school. We want teachers to talk to kids and say, hey, we're all going to recess, but I need to sit with you for 30 seconds. We have to have a conversation. And doing so without an audience is actually the best practice. Sometimes you'll actually do it outside the classroom before you send the kids to recess, but sometimes you'll do it as the recess transition is happening. But the research is very clear in the harm that is caused when repetitive recess restriction is used as a strategy. And it definitely disproportionately affects Black students, African-American students, and especially students with special needs who happen to also be Black or Latino or English learners, students with language deficiency. Annual site level disciplinary review teams. When I read this, what I think is missing is the timeline. I think we want principals to engage community members between May 15th and August 1st. Like it has to be in our student handbooks and it has to have representation from your school site council. Is kind of the best place to start it from. So that's what I would recommend we think about that. Your school site council is going to have parent representation, staff representation, and then what Trustee Corzo pointed out, the importance of reflective, demographically student representation, especially at our middle school. So it can't be 2 kids, it has to be 12 kids, and it has to be a mixture of kids, language, ethnicity, and even age. How do you guys feel about that? School site council, larger, middle school level. So like just adding a little bit more clarity to this part of it to suggest the composition of those teams as opposed to just parents. Is that,
Like how representative are the school site councils of like makeup of the school?
the nice thing about the school site council, I don't know, but the nice thing about the school site council is the school site council membership is predicated on those parents. Like in some cases, there are actual elections. There's an opportunity for a parent to say, I want to participate in this group. And it really, if it isn't a fair process, it should be a fair process at every school.
So I was on the school site council and I came in through the first way where it was nominated. And there was an actual vote to be on it.
Yeah.
And then after a couple, because it was a year or 2 year term, and then it became more inclusive where it's like, you know what, anybody can come. And that was great because you didn't have to be sort of nominated or elected to be on it. The problem is that in some schools, right, where we don't have as much parent participation, school site councils are like the principal and maybe a couple of teachers, there's not necessarily with the representation. So that's something that we'd have to work on if we're, basically running things through them.
In my experience, they recruit parents
Yeah.
from PTA.
Yeah, yeah.
So you end up with very involved parents who are, unfortunately for Black, good, better or for worse, it's the same parents.
Yeah.
Doing almost all the volunteering.
And at some smaller schools, it's a hard thing. So,
Maybe then just a recommendation as opposed to the specificity of it saying it has to be a
I love the intent. Yes.
school site council.
I love the intent. It's the implementation part. It's
Yeah.
just that, and this is all pre-COVID, the issues that we always had issues, not just with either PTA meetings or ELEC meetings, but, site councils, which is a different involvement.
Something for us to, on the administration side, to think a little bit more about that. Vice President Watkins, you pointed out in the BP, there's specific language calling out bias, historical. And how I would look at that is like, we have the board policy, which we want to be the vision. And this is the administrative regulation, which we want to be the practice. Adding it that's a conversation we can have. My recommendation to the board is that so let's go back to conduct. Conduct only has a BP. So conduct needs to have that type of language, and it has to have a little bit of practice too, because there's no AR for conduct. Discipline has both. Discipline has a BP and an accompanying AR. So I think I would like to hear from the board about that. My recommendation is because it's one of those policies that has both the BP and the matching AR, we want that clear, visionary intent language in the BP, and then we want the direct language to practitioners in the AR.
Can I just clarify? I think what I was hoping for is some of that direct language as it relates to bias perception of student behavior and discipline, right? So not necessarily like saying we believe in all of these things, but kind of similar to the paragraph on page 2 around students with IEPs, having some similar language around groups of students that have experienced and that historically experience, I don't know what the language is, like bias, disciplinary action that is more extreme or whatever, like something that's a little bit more tangible. So that's kind of what I was hoping for. And again, like this, it can still be open for discussion, obviously, but that's more what I meant.
Like a disproportionately punitive consequences disproportionately mischaracterized behavior or let me think about that.
I don't have the exact words, but it's just something around like the actual implementation and attention to that bias and that data, right, that we know exists in our district.
Great. BP 5145.11, questioning and apprehension by law enforcement, and Vice President Watkins, when the clock hits 3:02, if you will lead us off. Can we make photocopies so I'm not-
Yeah, thank you. I don't want my minutes here.
It's not taking 10 minutes to help us.
It's only certain things. I think when we have a separate project, it's different from. the other. Should have seen how first job for 5 years. Yeah.
Several hundred pages.
The box, like, card, everything.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, you know, my big takeaway is just the, you know, the elimination really of this ability of law enforcement to question, and, you know, students without notifying a parent or guardian, which, you know, was raised years ago and something that was called out in our school to prison pipeline resolution. And, you know, despite what we heard in public comments kind of throughout the time we were discussing it, the school to prison pipeline does exist and it starts at school. And so this is an ability for us to begin to stop that happening in certain places. My one wondering that I have is around, so this, if law enforcement is on campus for other reasons, for example, we have some of our schools that work with PAL, which is under the umbrella of SMPD. What are the restrictions around the types of questions or interactions that happen in those types of settings? I would be interested in us being really explicit about that, because my understanding is that there is still an ability for law enforcement to utilize that information in ways that may ultimately be harmful to students. And so I want to make sure that we're really explicit, not just if law enforcement is on campus for an issue or needs to question a student, but if they're just on campus, because, which is another, I have a request for kind of something that we talk about, and that's another issue around whether or not we think that that's okay, but that's a separate kind of conversation that I'll bring up maybe at the end of this.
Yeah, so one of the things I notice is just the amount of structures. And, you know, to me, looking at what is included in those strike-throughs, it astounds me that there was that much, I mean, like the officers were allowed that much leniency in, approaching the students in our district. One thing that, I just was wondering how the interaction of, or even if there is an interaction with this new community wellness and crisis response team that the San Mateo Police Department has, which is supposed to involve a mental health clinician and whatnot for some of these calls, that might involve, mental health and wellness. So I would just be curious to see how our interactions with the police and the questioning, I mean, I don't know if apprehension would fit with it, but just how that team with the police would fit in with this policy.
So my notice is similar. I feel like we are sort of rewriting this, which is really good. I think about specifically beyond the parent notification, which is huge. I think the ICE situation, because I remember when Noelle, Trustee Corzo, and I joined the Sanctuary Task Force at the beginning, this is one of the things that we were tackling at the very beginning. It was sort of like, how do we change these policies? What's going on here? And the realization that people can come on the campus, interrogate our students without, notification for the parents is eye-opening. I think we've all seen, what was that video maybe 2 or 3 years ago, before the pandemic, with the officers, and albeit it was not in our jurisdiction, it was somewhere else in the country, where they handcuffed a 5-year-old kid and walked them out of the class. That visual just doesn't sit well at all. So I do think that I'm really happy we're taking a look at it. The only wonder or sort of notice that I have actually is the request to insert the word negative in the second sentence of this. So because the word reads, this is the board is committed to reducing student contact with law enforcement juvenile systems, reducing the rate of school based arrest, citations, and everything else. To me, it's the reducing the negative student contact with law enforcement. I know that you have questions about Pal, but Pal, you know, does do a great service to a number of our kids, and they, and to me, I think that there's value in that. So I don't, it's hard to lump everything in together. And so that's my notice or wonder. But overall, I'm really glad that we're taking a look at this and maybe rewriting the legacy sort of language that is in.
I'm just gonna briefly just point out, like, I appreciate that there's language in here about ensuring that students and even adults have language access when interacting with folks that are in a position of power over them and their families. And then I just wanted to kind of like speak to your piece, and I hear where you're coming from. And I feel like I have always been very wary of like PAL programs, because in my lived experience, I have not seen police officers, not all police officers, obviously, right? I've been treated well by some police officers, but I've also been treated not well at all by some police officers. And how I feel like in some instances, and I've like said this in a forum with police officers, right? So this is not a surprise to anyone, but it's like, hey, ignore all of this harm that this department has done to your family for decades, and like, let's go play soccer. You know what I mean? Like, and there's also this kind of like monopoly that PAL has on activities that really should be like invested into the community directly to do their own activities, right? Like, it shouldn't, I don't know if I'm being clear enough on that, but I just wanted to share that piece, because it sometimes feels like PAL is like a marketing type of thing, and they do a lot of good activities, and it's true, but there's also a lot of families that will not even participate in those activities because they've been harmed so much by police officers and the criminal justice system overall. So, and then that puts really vulnerable kids and families in an even more vulnerable place.
So I guess my observation of this is that, I don't know, maybe I wonder also, I want to make sure that they're like the school site and the district, like they are there to protect children. And that if there's like the paragraph that I started is talks about a minor students removed from school into the custody of law enforcement. Like, and I know it references ed code there, so I'm guessing it's required, but that like breaks my heart that the police could take a child and there's not a parent there. And it makes me wonder, like, who at the school is making sure that the student is okay and protecting them and making sure that, you know, they're not saying the wrong thing, and maybe they're in trouble because they did something bad, but somebody needs to like not be mad at them and protect them. And so that's what I was concerned about there. And then just like being like, I guess, a little on the untrusting side, just negative about this, is that I think that I'm wondering in the first page where it talks about unless the student is suspected of a victim of child abuse, like how is that documented? Who determined? I mean, like, could that be manipulated in a way that someone says, well, we were suspecting child abuse and really that wasn't the case, and they really just wanted to talk to the student without a parent. Please protect the
Let me
children.
start there. Yeah, let me start there
Mhm.
and go in reverse order again.
Can I add one more thing? Sorry, I
Yes.
forgot. There's a part in here, an area in here that says, with the student's approval, the principal or other trusted adult of the student's choosing may be present during the interview. And I thought that was important because I think about like in my sister's situation, if my mom was there, my mom would be totally intimidated, scared, not know what to do. But if I had been there to advocate for my sister, I could have done that much more effectively.
Of the students choosing. That's the key with that. It is very common for a child at school A to have a sibling who doesn't attend school A, but maybe is older or younger, to have a whole child abuse investigation process happen. And law enforcement and the Department of Child and Family Services decide we need to remove the children from the home. We can't let them, like, the student at school A needs to be pulled from school A because we're moving them into foster care. That's the circumstance that you're reading about, like an example of that kind of circumstance. And sometimes reading these board policies, you'll say, this paragraph isn't connected to this paragraph. And sometimes reading policies, you'll say, these do fall directly in line with each other. So if you go to the first page of this proposed policy, you'll see the very intentional language around how we define when students can even be questioned by law enforcement, under what circumstances, what other measures have been taken, who has been contacted, to what extent have they been contacted, ensuring that they have a right to be present. So this is a circumstance where that really is kind of a package that we put together to make sure that the school official is protecting the child. 5 years ago, it would have been, come right in, officer, pull her from class. It would have been immediate. So now we're just looking at it differently. We're just dealing with it differently. The board, you all will need to discuss in public how you define contact. Trustee A might say PAL has a positive impact. Trustee B might say PAL has a negative impact, or it isn't a positive impact for everybody who experiences it. In terms of this policy being about questioning and apprehension, in my opinion, my advice to the board is that the PAL conversation is separate from this policy that is very focused on questioning and apprehension. But it merits discussion. And we just did a school visitation, and PAL was right there. We walked up, there were 3 police officers and a little rookie, their emotional support animal. This beautiful, pet. So I think that conversation needs to happen. And at the board's direction at a future meeting, I'd be happy to suggest a process for us to be able to do that. The community wellness and crisis response is a part of an apparatus or a lever that works with our student services department. Not necessarily under the questioning and apprehension, but also another one of those, it is aligned. And then there was a question about defining PAL and defining those services. We're not going to discuss bullying. And the reason we're not going to discuss bullying is because it's not ready for the board to discuss bullying. We have to finish the process of the ETF feedback and then the district staff incorporating and finalizing that feedback and getting legal to look over the proposed document. The process we just went through is a process I'll recommend that the board utilize again in the fall. I expect to propose 6 policies for the board's consideration before this school year lets out. They're the policies you looked at today, in addition to the 2 bullying policies. July is gonna get here and I'm not bringing you any policies in July. August is gonna get here and I'm not bringing you anything in August because we're gonna be totally focused on opening schools successfully. But I do want to have a follow-up session like this, a special study session, because we'll have a group of new 10 to 12 policies to look at like this. And they really do merit this amount of, like everybody needs to be heard. Everybody needs to think through it and be heard about it, because, thank you, Tatiana. Because if not, what happens is you'll be at a regular school board meeting and all of our internal clocks will be ticking. How many more agenda items are there? What time is it? How much public comment is going to be on there? And we'll rush through it and we'll feel badly about the process. So my recommendation to the board is, before we take these to open session, we do this so that we've gotten all of our input through the process. And we opened up for public input on the process as well. It comes to you all May 12th for information and potentially May 26th for approval. And then the same process with bullying, May 26th, and then I believe it's June 8th. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the board.
I have one thing to add just about the questioning and apprehension. So I agree in terms of the PAL piece being separate, with the exception of, and I'm interested to see what you all think. I do still think it warrants, if law enforcement is on campus for any reason, what are the rules around questioning, like in the questioning and apprehension piece? And I don't, do you feel like that's in here?
I think what, so let's say we're, just what happened the other day, we were at Bayside observing classes. Law enforcement was present, and if a circumstance took place where any one of the 3 law enforcement were to ask to question the student, it basically pops over to the policy about questioning. The function of being there for a investigatory reason, like they happen to be there, but maybe while there, they receive some information that says, oh, we suspect criminal activity has taken place and we want to interview a student about that concern, then we push into this policy, which is we need to pick up the phone, call parents or guardians, and follow the procedure.
I guess my question is more around, there's no criminal, but I'm just playing soccer and I want to ask the student a question and I'm not telling anyone that I'm doing that, right? And so maybe that falls under more of an MOU or whatever that we have.
Exactly. Where it's defined.
Yeah.
So that, because your point is like, it's not all negative. Also, if it's there and it's like being described as this is about physical fitness and this is about wellness, then we're like being very clear if we are not questioning children during this point. But again, I'll be, with the board's direction, suggest a process for us to go through that, and an MOU is a very likely outcome.
Yeah, which is a part of the resolution. It's either MOU or whether it's the policy, but how do we as a district engage with police? Because as I told Diego, like I was very surprised to go to Bayside and have police there, given the resolution. Like it doesn't feel in alignment. And I feel like we definitely need to have that conversation and we need to have an MOU. And again, it's a part of the resolution. I also think we need, and I mentioned this to Diego, disaggregated data to make that decision. So to your point around PAL is positive, what do our kids think, right? About police, about PAL, like what do they think and who thinks that? And that needs to drive how we proceed, right? It isn't about actually what we think, right? It should be about what our students and families think and what makes them feel safe. And I feel like we're going to need that data in order to like have an informed discussion and make decisions.
Well, I
think this has been a really great conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing this. We are ready to adjourn if everybody is in agreement.
So there's no motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Trustee Corzo, thank you for the motion, and trustee Watkins, the second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, that was everybody. Thank you. Well, adjourned, Pat.